Welcome to this video. I'm dedicating this video today to someone who brought to my attention yesterday a very important topic that we must talk about and that we've touched upon in earlier lectures, and that is the topic of the archetype. And what sparked talking about this today, although I've been avoiding the concrete word archetype in previous conversations, is that this person has mentioned to me, they've told me a story about how both of us have experienced a deceased parent in a very specific manner that does not correspond to the parent as such. And so basically what sparked this discussion was, I said, look, I was standing in the kitchen earlier today, and I saw my daughter and my wife play outside, and I said, I thought to myself, and later then expressed to my wife, oh, it's very unfortunate in moments like these I miss my mother. My mother passed away quite young. Well, she was young, I was younger, I was about 18. And I've never really, there are a few moments, subsequent to the first couple of years when I feel this loss very intensively. And in that moment I felt it very intensively because I looked at both of them playing and in the garden, and I sort of saw a horse on the horizon. I mean, not the horizon, but just down the road. A horse with a rider. My mother used to, love riding, horse riding, and she would have loved living where we live, and it's right next to a couple of farms and so on. And so I thought to myself, and later expressed, she would have really enjoyed being here, and it would be amazing to have her around, also around her grandchildren, and so on. And so I expressed this sentiment to my friend later that day, and she said, I have this, sometimes I reminisce back to my father, who had also passed away, and quite young. Well, again, she was quite young, he was also young, but not like 12. And she said, sometimes I also think back, he would have blah blah blah, and then she mentioned, she said, but look, this is an idealized version we think back to, because both of us had quite some trouble, I suppose, with these parents, and with my mother, it was she died of a brain tumor, and I suppose she was suffering severely from that even previously, and had some personality, structural personality, I would say, disorder previous to that, undiagnosed, and of course that's has effects on living together and so on. So it was not always easy, and because of that, and that friend knows of this particular setup, and she, and that's what motivated that statement, that essentially that is an idealized image, and to an extent, of course, that's not true. She would have enjoyed being here anyways, despite that, but you do block out certain aspects. And okay, on the one hand, you can say empirical psychology would explain this by saying, we have a positivity bias, and we tend to forget the negative experiences, especially in relation to people, and tend to highlight the positive ones, and thereby reshape. But then the question you may ask from a philosophical standpoint is, okay, why does consciousness do that? Why do we have or consciousness in Jungian terms, right? Why do we have the propensity to block out certain negative instances? And then also you will have to ask the question, who blocks out, and what is a negative instance, right? What is a positive instance? And the way I'm using these terms, negative and positive, I think has become clear I've touched upon it briefly in other lectures, I've written about it extensively, is in terms of judgment. So in terms of again, we have to take, as Jungians always do, we have to take the perspective of the Ich complex, and in that perspective, we're bound to considering circumstances from the vantage point of the continuity that this central complex creates, and this continuity's intentions. And I'm not saying there's a reflection, an element that we attribute to consciousness within the Ich complex, and it originates there, but there's still this volition is a property of consciousness that's not inherent to the central building block of how consciousness appears and manifests. Okay, so the Ich complex, we've spoken about this. The Ich complex, although being the central sort of axiom of what enables consciousness on the structural network level that we've spoken about, although it's the center, it's not the phenomenon of consciousness as such, which is defined by, we've spoken about it, among others, this aspect of personal volition. I can recall, I can reflect, and at least in with significant amount of work sometimes, but I can reflect on aspects of consciousness, which includes, as we've established, the majority of the Freudian unconscious, and so when we speak of judgment, positive and negative, or for that matter, positive and negative experiences that we highlight or repress or block out, we get asked, okay, what is a positive experience? And here, again, let's take this perspective of ego consciousness. Whatever is negative pertains to a threat to the current constant, the current dominant, the current conscious dominant. So the current dominant complex, the Ich complex, that's currently ruling the conscious realm. And whatever is experienced as positive reinforces it. Now, it doesn't mean that anything experienced as positive necessarily, if I think of myself as particularly tall and anyone's saying I'm short, okay, this is a very simplified notion, but everyone saying I'm short is essentially a negative judgment, and everyone saying I'm tall is positive. That's not necessarily the case. It could be, it's just that anything that is not a threat, I consider a positive judgment, and that includes those assertions that are neutral, right? That can be interpreted in a certain manner that fits this, again, the property of consciousness, is this continuity that originates in the complex, right? This idea of continuity, coherence, and negative judgment is threatening this coherence. So I'm not saying I'm differentiating it from this instance of rupture, so from this instance of breaking, in which an actual gap is instantiated. So this punctum, as Roland Barthes, I hope that's correct French, says that's punctuating, right? That's coming out of consciousness. Roland Barthes speaks of it in relation to pictures, where you have a photograph that shows something on the level of what he calls studium. So the common interpretation, if you will, the common interpretatory framework, if you will, that continuity that's dominating. Certain social, or in our example case, personal discourse. Personal discourse meaning, who am I? Private. It's a private. Well, arguably it's a public discourse, isn't it? Arguably, it's a public discourse, because consciousness, and especially the Ich complex, we've compared it in earlier videos to the ambassador of a certain town. It's the ambassador that goes out. What do you know about a town? What do you know about some Turkmenistan? Like what do you know about Turkmenistan? And you know what you see on the news, and maybe on documentaries. Maybe you don't know anything. You know what you read on the internet. You know what you what those ambassadors tell you, and by ambassador I don't mean the person that works in the governmental office, but I mean the like student ambassador. What is a student ambassador? Well, it's a person who goes out from a certain university and ventures into the other lands and so on, and promotes the university. And will they tell you the whole truth of the university? Well, do the news tell you the whole truth about Turkmenistan? Well, it may not even be bad intentions, but it's simply limited by its means. They can't tell you the entire truth of anything. It doesn't work, right? So, and there's a second aspect, of course, that adds to the complexity, which is you receive the news. You receive the news as yourself, subjugated by this ambassador structure, this ich complex, which is in your at the center of your conscious mind, at the center of your experience of the world, and that leads to the problem that you can only apprehend in relation to this structure that's at a given moment given. It's not given at birth. That's we've spoken about that, but it's given in a given moment. Like right now, I can't encounter any situation. Encounter not in the encounter sense that I use the term in relation to rupture, but as in, a moment cannot come before me neutrally, as it were. Okay, well, great that we've spent 12 minutes talking about something else. I think we can now loop back to the question at hand, which is, when I thought about my mother, I thought about an idealized version of her, and I don't so much want to talk about these kinds of this issue on the level of consciousness, so on the level of what we maybe would call projections, on the level of projections which pertain or relate to certain structure in consciousness, but I want to talk about it in terms of the archetypes. I want to use it as a springboard to speak about the effect of the archetype as topography, which we spoke about. We spoke about in an earlier lecture about the position of consciousness within the unconscious as a structure, for lack of a better word, as topography again, and we spoke about, and we gave the metaphor of topography, of a landscape, right, of certain given variables by a landscape, and we maintained that, or we suggested that essentially you have different psychic topographies, and different individuals are not all the same, but they're instead constituted of the same elements, but in different that express the different extents. So one landscape, every landscape has hills, and every landscape has climate or weather. It's a local phenomenon. So every landscape has weather and some kind of hill, but landscapes differ in terms of how many hills they have and what kind of weather they have, right? So, and sorry, just to finish this thought, and in that way you have an overlapping structure that's relatively equal across individuals, but it differs in its nuances. And if you take the sum or the mean of all individuals, for that matter, if you take this, sorry, embarrassing. If you take the sum of all individuals, you get a whole, or the mean, or either. Not sure. In any case, if you pool all individuals, there's sort of a picture of wholeness, and as we will see that some thinkers, among them Bernardo Kastrup, consider therefore that this wholeness, or read in Jung that this wholeness, which is posited as the end product of individuation, of the individual's development through life, psychic development through life, and the goal of that individuation, as is posited here, is wholeness, and that's the teleological goal, right? It's the achievement, it's the sort of the filling out or living to the most extent, integrating, as it were, these topographical elements in your own topography, not all of them because you can, but in your own topography, integrating those elements into consciousness, right? And that's individuation, becoming a personality. And I disagree, and maybe I agree, but there's another way to arrive at that. I have another way to arrive at that conclusion. If I even have to arrive at that conclusion, I think it just has to be left open. It doesn't matter. I don't. This thinking in terms of teleology or teleological development is, in my opinion, it's not necessary to derive that from Jung's writings. Many derive it from the writings on the self, and I challenge that. In any case, let's try to understand what an archetype is. So what does it mean to perceive someone as a mother? I had this discussion with in other context with a good friend of the family, and she's an older lady, and you know, she said, with regards to my daughter, or our daughter, she said, oh, this girl doesn't have a real grandmother, you know, because my wife's daughter is, you know, still quite young and vibrant and so on, so she's not what we call the grandmother archetype, and she doesn't act like it either, and so, you know, there's a lack here, there's a certain lack, and the question is, why is that lack there? Okay. And the response is, of course, you could respond in multiple ways, and I'm not going to get in that discussion, but the question that arises is, what does it mean to be a grandmother? And why does she say she doesn't have a grandmother? Because, you know, biologically she of course has two. You know, one of them is dead, the other one's there, but, you know, it's not a real grandmother apparently. So why not? Why do we all immediately agree and say, oh no, yeah, you're right, you know, she's not? And why is that? Well, the reason, according to Jung, is that there are certain patterns, certain patterns that structure our experience, if you will, or structure our apprehension of grandmother and mother, okay, and father, right, and nature. So there are certain, certain archetypes, and again, it reminds you, makes the analogy of Plato's forms, and I'll make a separate video on a comparison. But what we can maintain is that if we say, okay, my daughter doesn't have a proper grandmother, what we mean is there is no person representing that archetype. And what it of course also means is there seems to be a certain demand for that archetype to be represented. And it doesn't seem to be tied to the biological person embodying that role, although it may become tied to it, and again, and this is now the most fascinating part, it can change and vary. While in a certain moment, a certain period of time, you may tie it to a certain person, and this is all speaking from the perspective of the person who experiences. So let's take me as a guinea pig, and if I was to, for instance, I had, after my mother died, this mother image, and perhaps arguably before that, but I don't think so. I think when she died, this mother image was sort of, there was no mother for me anymore. And what I then did is I perhaps, for a period of time, projected this mother image on my mother-in-law, and so that was my so this archetype manifested. That didn't really work out. So perhaps, many men projected, I don't know if I do that, I don't think so, projected it on my wife, but I don't think I did, because I projected it more on that same woman that is now saying, oh, I could be your daughter's grandmother. and certainly there was a projection going, or there is a projection going on there, but the bottom line is that you have certain tendencies, and again, this brings us back to this question of ghost. There is this in another manner, and I don't want to confuse. You can't think along. You feel free to reach out, or as it were, add a comment wherever you can add a comment to this video or send an email. But I think we have to think about ghosts not only in the way that he's spoken about earlier, that they can approach me at rupture, but also that there are certain elements, there are certain it's very difficult to, it's very unpalatable, it's very difficult to say it, there's certain free radicals, if you will, that are looking for a connection. There are certain templates or certain pots that are looking for a lid. I don't know how to say it. There are certain elements, and this is, again, to give the topographical analogy, the topography that we inhabit is looking for a conscious, real life, let's say, associate to inhabit it. There's the land of the forest, and that land is looking for someone to live in there. And if it's empty because that connection is broken, because there's a certain melancholia going on, because let's say my mother inhabited that land and then she died, and that's a loss of libido, or libido drawn back into the ich, and there's sadness and again melancholia. But then there's this emptiness, and this emptiness, it can't remain empty, but it remains, it's an emptiness, okay? It's not that it's gonna, people say wounds heal, do they? Do they? Wounds, as, and Zizek brings this up, and he takes it from Wagner, and I don't know the literal quote, unfortunately, and I don't know, and he uses it in another context, I suppose, but there's this quote from Wagner's, I think, Nibelungen, and it's heilen kann die Wunde nur der Dolch, welcher hat sie geschlagen, something along those lines. But so it's like the wound can only be healed by the knife that created the wound, right? And it's funny because a wound doesn't bleed. If you stab someone, okay, this is my heart. If you stab someone, you leave the knife in, it doesn't bleed, right? Because the wound is filled with that. It depends where you stab them, but the wound is filled with that object, right? And ultimately, I guess that's true because there is a certain connection. Everything has a certain position within this network of the ego, of the ich complex, and a certain element is removed, again, that corresponds to negative judgment, right? Because something is removed, something is ruptured in that continuity if it had a relevance for the coherence of the set, and that element is removed, then there's a lack, there's a hole. Well, you can now fill that with another person. You can see if they match. Well, how do you determine they match? How do you explain that? How do you explain that some people get over breakups better than others? How do you explain that some people get over losses better than others? Okay, you can say psychic constitution, higher resilience, or you can find a proper explanation on the level of theory. Sorry, my computer goes black from time to time. So this is, I think, this is a key point. And so there are these archetypal needs that need to be filled. They need to be filled with something. They demand to be filled, and they make themselves filled by striking you. When you go through the world and you see someone, let's talk about a more severe subcomponent of the archetype of the Great Mother. And Erich Neumann has a great book about the Great Mother. It's the anima. The anima, right? That's a sub, if you will, expression of the archetype of the Great Mother, and it's often projected on, for men, it's the female component of the soul. It's for men, it's the leader into the unconscious. There's beautiful shamanic story. It's a story from the initiation of a shamanic tribe or a shamanic group, and I'm trying to come up with the name. I can't, but there's this guide. So when the shaman, who's typically a male, in this case, in this guild or group, it's a group of male shamans, because there's a separation in general when it comes to the initiations, at least in those tribes, at least all tribes I'm aware of. And there's this male shaman, and they have a dream, or he has a dream, but this pertains to all shamans, and they meet a guide into, this is their first initiation dream, and they meet a guide, and this guide has a specific name. It's a spirit, the spiritus familiaris, as Jung calls it, the familiar spirit. And you meet the spirit, and in this case, it's a woman, it's a female. It has some kind of name, something. I'm sorry, I forgot to write about it in my book, And Always Within a Never. It's somewhere in one of the shaman chapters. I give the entire dream. And this woman never leaves the side of this shaman, and it's a very healthy relationship because she never leaves his side, but she's also not too attached. You know, she doesn't make any demands. She could kill him. She has powers over him because I think she takes a fragment of his soul in return for the guidance or something along those lines. And I think, or maybe I'm mixing up two stories, but I think she appears in the form of a reindeer and leaves him with a hair, reindeer hair, that he can then always use to when he pounds the drums. He can use that to get into this state of ecstasy and use her as a guide. And the idea is that you don't want to go into the unconscious unguided. Look, this is another thing. If you stepping outside of consciousness, however it is done, is dangerous. You always face the threat of psychosis. You face the threat of not being able to reassemble this conscious dominance, continuity. And what does it mean? Well, it means technically you're not a subject in that matter. I mean, this is a very stark claim, but how are you going to function? What makes us subjective in a way is the ability to exercise volition and control. You lose that element of control. And so you should really be careful when you venture into the unconscious, and we'll get to examples of that. And this pertains to negative judgments as well, right? From what we've learned so far, you can increase the strength of the ich complex that always has the threat of hubris, that it becomes tyrannical. And we'll get I hope at some point we'll get to ways of protecting and bad ways of building such hubris in later lectures. The point is that if there's a threat of negative judgment, the threat of rupture, the threat of this coherent structure breaking down, then how do you make sure it doesn't? Well, one way is to just never encounter anything. Just never encounter anything. That's very difficult because, as I said, you can walk around in this projection. You can walk around and suddenly you fall in love. How does that work? How do you suddenly fall in love? You see someone and you go mad. You go mad. You just see them. You don't maybe talk to them or whatever. Maybe hear them talk. You hear them talk. You smell a certain scent. You hear a certain voice. You see certain facial features, certain physical features, certain personality features, certain whatever it is, and you're in love. What does that mean? What happened? Well, armor striked again, kind of, But what does that mean? Well, it means that that where a lack has been, where there's an empty forest, as I said, where a mother has died, or where another aspect in that network has died, and that's to be replaced, well, that spirit has just found, or that ghost has just found its place again. It has just manifested, it's just situated itself, and then it came back. And can you do anything about it? No. Well, that begs the question, are you your own? Do you own yourself? Are you your owner? We would think of ourselves. I wrote about this today. Fortunately, I'm not finished with the chapter, but I wrote about it today. Like, who owns yourselves? Who's the owner and the operator and we may be the managing directors. The Ich complex may be the managing director of the continuity it narrates. But is it this is the main shareholder? No. I say, and I'll prove this, at least if proof exists, I'll elaborate on it in other lectures. I think there's a multiplicity. There's a multiplicity of shareholders. It's very fragmented. I'd argue that the contents, I'd argue, and I think I've alluded to this. I'd argue that the elements of the set that make up this continuity, that network that is controlled by the central narrative, I'd argue that these elements do not belong to us. They're strangers. They're strangers that are made familiar under the guise of the central narrative. But they're strangers. Geister. Ghosts. So, what is an archetype in this? How does an archetype express on this level? I didn't get. I had two books here I wanted to quote from. Among them, Jung's Archetypes in the Collective. This is just to prove that I'm trying to educate myself as well. Archetypal, das kollektive, unbewusste Archetypes in the collective conscious. Well, anyways, maybe I'll make another video on this. But what I wanted to get through today is that the archetype is there and it's lacking to be filled, and it fills itself. It itself is the locus of control, and the Ich complex in the center pretends to be in control, but it's not. It really isn't. It can be stricken. Hope that's the right word. Struck. It can be struck by the archetype, like it can be struck by lightning, or struck by an idea, or and so on. So there's an autonomy in the archetypes. We've talked about it. This is an example. And there's a need to fill them. And that originates in them, in their topography. Okay, I'll close there. I hope this was helpful, and see you next time.